The wind was a predator, a shrieking phantom of ice and teeth that hunted the high plains. It clawed at the tattered remains of what was once a wedding dress, turning fine silk and lace into frozen, whipping rags that clung to Alara's trembling frame. Each breath was a shard of glass in her lungs, each step a gamble against the blinding white that had swallowed the world whole. The blizzard had erased the trail behind her, just as she prayed it would erase the man she fled. Alistair Finch. His name was a brand on her soul, a promise of a gilded cage where her spirit would wither and die. She had run, not with a plan, but with the primal instinct of a cornered animal, clutching a secret that was heavier than any hope she possessed. The cold was no longer an external force. It was seeping into her marrow, a slow, crystalline poison. Her legs, numb and unfeeling, finally betrayed her. She stumbled, a final, graceless pirouette into a deep drift, the snow a soft, deceptively gentle shroud. The shrieking of the wind softened to a lullaby, and as darkness rushed in from the edges of her vision, her last coherent thought was not of the man she was running from, but of the profound, crushing loneliness of her end. The world was vast and white and utterly indifferent. She was a whisper of defiance about to be silenced by a roar of nature, a fallen star extinguished before it could ever truly burn bright. And in that final moment, she surrendered to the cold peace, the white oblivion that promised an end to fear, an end to flight, an end to everything. The last thing she felt was the delicate touch of a single snowflake melting on her frozen cheek, a final, cold tear shed by the sky itself. This is the story of a woman who ran from a gilded cage and a man who had built a prison around his own heart. It is a tale that asks a simple, yet profound question. Can a soul frozen by grief find its thaw in the warmth of another's survival? We invite you to journey with us into the heart of the unforgiving frontier, to a place where survival is a daily prayer and love is the most dangerous and necessary miracle of all. What happens when a protector who has lost everything finds someone who has nothing left to lose? Their story is a testament to the fact that sometimes, the most fortified walls are not made of stone or timber, but of sorrow, and only the most patient and courageous love can ever hope to bring them down. We begin in the heart of the storm, where one life is about to end, and another is about to find its reason to begin again. The great white wolf moved like a whisper through the swirling chaos, a creature of the storm itself. Lakota tracked it not with his eyes, which were narrowed against the stinging wind, but with an older sense, a knowledge of the land that ran as deep as the roots of the ancient pines. He was a man carved from the same rugged material as the mountains he called home, his face a mask of stoic grief, his heart a fortress of self-imposed solitude. The world of men, with its treaties written in ink and broken by greed, had taken everything from him: his wife, his son, the laughter of his people. Now, his only communion was with the wild things, his only language the silence of the snow-laden forest. The wolf was a worthy adversary, a mirror to his own solitary existence. But as he crested a ridge, the wind carried a scent that did not belong. It was the scent of city perfume, of fear, and of life fading like the last embers of a dying fire. His eyes, sharp and accustomed to discerning the slightest disturbance in the snow, found her. A splash of white against white, a human form half buried in a drift, the tattered finery of her dress a grotesque mockery in this brutal landscape. A part of him, the wounded part that craved isolation, urged him to turn away. She was from their world, the world that had cost him his own. Bringing her into his life, even for a moment, was to invite the ghosts of his past to howl alongside the storm. But another part of him, a deeper part, the part that held the honor of his ancestors, could not leave a living thing to perish. He knelt beside her, his large, calloused hand brushing the snow from her face. She was so pale, her lips the color of faded lavender. A runaway, he surmised, from a life of comfort she could not bear. He had run, too, but from a life of pain he could no longer endure. In her fragile, unconscious form, he saw not an enemy, but a reflection of his own flight. With a sigh that plumed like a spirit in the frigid air, he made his choice. He gathered her into his arms, her slight weight a shock against his powerful frame. She was as light as a broken bird. As he turned his back to the wind and began the arduous trek back to his cabin, he did not know that he was not just carrying a stranger. He was carrying the seed of a future he had long since buried, a fragile ember of hope that he would have to shield against the storms both outside and within his own wounded soul. The cabin, his sanctuary of solitude, was about to become something else entirely. It was about to become a crucible. Elara awoke to the scent of wood smoke and roasting meat, a smell so fundamentally alive it was a shock to her senses. For a moment, she believed she was in a fever dream, that the white oblivion had conjured a final, comforting mirage. Then her eyes fluttered open. She was not in the snow. She was lying on a pallet of soft furs, a rough-spun but heavy blanket covering her. A fire crackled in a stone hearth across the small, one-room cabin, casting flickering shadows on the log walls. Panic, cold and sharp, pierced through the fog of her exhaustion. She tried to sit up, but a wave of dizziness sent her reeling back into the furs. Her dress was gone. In its place, she wore a large tunic made of soft deerskin that smelled of pine and smoke. It was a man's tunic. Her eyes darted around the room, taking in the sparse, masculine details. A stack of cured pelts in one corner, a meticulously clean rifle resting on pegs by the door, a small table with a single chair. And then she saw him. He was sitting at the table, his back to her, sharpening a knife with long, deliberate strokes. He was broad-shouldered, with hair as black as a raven's wing tied back from his face. He wore buckskin leggings and a simple shirt, the muscles of his back and arms moving with a fluid, practiced grace. He was an Indian. A savage, the terrified, city-bred part of her mind screamed. Her heart hammered against her ribs, a frantic drumbeat of fear. She had escaped the gilded cage of Alistair Finch only to fall into the hands of a wild man of the mountains. Was this a new kind of prison? He must have sensed her movement, or perhaps heard the hitch in her breath, because he stopped his work. Without turning, he spoke, his voice a low rumble like distant thunder. "You are safe." The words were simple, yet they did nothing to quell the terror that constricted her throat. Safe? How could she be safe, alone and helpless with a stranger, a man whose people were spoken of in hushed, fearful tones back east? He rose slowly, placing the knife and whetstone on the table, and turned to face her. His face was stern, etched with lines of hardship and sorrow that the firelight deepened into canyons. His eyes, dark and piercing, held no discernible emotion. They simply watched her, assessing her. He was not what she expected. There was no wild fury in his gaze, only a profound stillness, a deep-rooted calm that was more unnerving than any overt threat. He picked up a wooden bowl from the hearth and walked towards her. Elara flinched, pressing herself deeper into the furs. He stopped a few feet away, his expression unchanging. "You must eat, to get your strength back." He set the bowl on the floor beside the pallet and retreated back to the fire, giving her space. It was a gesture of consideration she did not expect. The aroma of the stew was tantalizing, a rich, savory promise that made her stomach ache with a hunger she hadn't realized she felt. But fear was a stronger master than hunger. She could only stare at him, her mind racing. Who was this man? Why had he saved her? What did he want from her? The questions swirled in her mind, a vortex of suspicion and terror. He had saved her life, yes, but for what purpose? In her world, no man did anything for a woman without expecting something in return. The blizzard did not relent. For 3 days, the world outside the small cabin was a maelstrom of white fury, the wind a constant mournful howl against the sturdy log walls. The cabin became an island in a featureless sea, and Elara and the silent man her only inhabitants. The initial terror that had seized her began to slowly, almost imperceptibly, recede, worn down not by words, but by the steady, unassuming rhythm of their shared confinement. He never pressed her, never demanded answers. He moved about the small space with an economy of motion that spoke of a life lived without waste. He would rise before the first hint of gray light, stoke the fire, and disappear outside for a short time, returning with an armload of firewood, his shoulders dusted with snow. He would cook their meals in silence, simple but nourishing food, broth, roasted game, tough but wholesome bread. He gave her the better portions, the softer furs, the spot closest to the life-giving warmth of the hearth. He asked for nothing. This quiet, unconditional care was a language Alara had never known. Alistair's care had been a transaction, a gilded gift that came with the expectation of her absolute submission. This man, this stranger, offered her sustenance and safety and seemed to want only for her to heal. On the second day, she found the strength to sit up properly, and on the third, she stood on shaky legs. He watched her progress from across the room, his dark eyes missing nothing, but he did not offer a hand unless she truly faltered. He was allowing her to reclaim her own strength, a courtesy so profound it startled her. She began to notice the small details of his life, the way he meticulously cleaned his rifle each evening, the small, intricate carvings of animals on the handles of his tools, the deep, almost sorrowful respect he showed for the animals he hunted, using every part, wasting nothing. This was not the behavior of a mindless savage. This was the discipline of an honorable man. That evening, as he sat mending a snowshoe, the silence between them felt different. It was no longer a chasm of fear, but a space of quiet contemplation. She finally found her voice, though it was raspy from disuse. "Why?" He paused his work, his hands stilling over the rawhide webbing. He did not look up immediately. When he finally did, his gaze was direct, holding hers across the flickering space. The storm was not your time to die. It was not the answer she expected. It was not about him or what he wanted. It was a simple statement of fact, as elemental as the fire and the snow. "You don't know me," she whispered, the words tasting strange on her tongue. "I could be a terrible person." For the first time, the corner of his mouth twitched, the barest hint of a smile that did not reach his haunted eyes. "The mountain does not judge the fallen sparrow," he said, his voice low and even. "It only offers a branch to rest on. If the sparrow chooses to fly again, that is its own journey." He returned to his work, the conversation clearly over. Alara lay back in the furs, his words echoing in her mind. A fallen sparrow, a branch to rest on. He saw her not as property, not as a woman, not as an opportunity, but simply as a life that needed shelter. The realization was a revelation, a tiny seed of trust planted in the frozen soil of her fear. She didn't know his name or his story, but in that moment, she knew she was not his prisoner. She was his guest. The storm broke on the fifth day, leaving behind a world transformed. The sun, a stranger for nearly a week, spilled across the snow-covered landscape, turning it into a blinding expanse of diamonds. The silence that followed the wind's retreat was profound, broken only by the drip of melting icicles from the cabin eaves. With the path to the outside world now visible, a new tension settled between them. The reason for their shared confinement was gone. She was free to leave. Yet, the thought of returning to the world that held Alistair Finch filled her with a dread that was colder than any blizzard. Coda seemed to sense her turmoil. That morning, he did not just leave food for her. He spoke. "The snow is deep. The way is hard for one who does not know it." He was not telling her to stay, nor was he telling her to go. He was simply stating a truth. He took a small block of wood and his carving knife and sat by the fire. Alara watched as his powerful hands, which could so easily snap a branch or skin a deer, moved with incredible delicacy and precision. He was not just whittling. He was breathing life into the wood. After a time, he held it out to her. It was a small, perfect rendering of a sparrow, its head cocked as if listening, its tiny form poised for flight. She took it, the smooth wood warm in her palm. It was a gift, a symbol of her own fragile state, and a promise of her potential to fly again. The gesture unlocked something within her, a dam of fear and secrecy that finally broke. "My name is Alara," she said, her voice quiet but clear. He nodded slowly, his eyes holding hers. "I am Coda." The simple exchange of names felt monumental, a formal treaty of trust signed in the quiet cabin. That evening, emboldened by his grace, she told him. She told him everything. She spoke of Alistair Finch not just as a cruel suitor, but as the monster he truly was. She confessed her secret, the reason for her desperate flight. She had witnessed Alistair, in a fit of rage over a soured business deal, beat a poor farmer to death, a man who had refused to sell his ancestral land. Alistair had paid off the local sheriff, framed another man for the crime, and planned to marry Alara to ensure her silence, to own her and her secret completely. "He won't stop looking for me," she finished, her voice trembling. "To him, I am not a person. I am a loose end." Coda listened without interruption, his face an unreadable mask in the firelight. The silence stretched after she finished, thick with the weight of her confession. She feared she had burdened him, brought the ugliness of her world into his sanctuary. When he finally spoke, his voice was heavy. "My family did not die in a storm. They were killed by men like yours. Men who saw land and life as things to be owned and taken." He did not elaborate, but he did not have to. In his stark, painful admission, he had offered a piece of his own brokenness to match hers. He had shown her the ghosts that haunted his solitude. He stood up and walked to the door, looking out at the vast, starry sky. "You are not a loose end," he said, his back still to her. "Here you are not a secret to be kept. You are a life to be protected. His world will not touch you here." It was a declaration, a vow spoken to the mountains and the stars. For the first time in months, Alara felt a single, unfamiliar tear of gratitude slide down her cheek. She was no longer just a fallen sparrow. She was a sparrow under the protection of the mountain itself. In the weeks that followed, the cabin transformed from a temporary shelter into a nascent home. The world outside thawed, revealing the tender green shoots of spring, and with it, something inside both Alara and Coda began to unfreeze as well. The slow burn of trust, kindled in the heart of the blizzard, now grew into the steady warmth of companionship. Coda began to teach her the ways of his world, not with formal lessons but through shared action. He showed her how to read the tracks of deer in the soft earth, how to find the sweet, edible roots that grew near the creek, how to listen to the language of the birds to know when a predator was near. Alara, a woman who had been raised to master piano concertos and French literature, found a surprising aptitude for this new, more vital knowledge. She discovered a resilience in herself she never knew she possessed. Her hands, once soft and pale, became capable, learning to stitch a tear in Coda's buckskin shirt with a bone needle, to knead dough for their daily bread, to tend the small herb garden she started just outside the cabin door. Her fear, once a constant companion, was replaced by a quiet competence. She was no longer a damsel in distress waiting for rescue. She was a survivor learning to thrive. The silence between them also changed. It was no longer a void but a comfortable, shared space. They would sit by the fire in the evenings, he carving, she mending, the only sounds the crackle of the flames and the gentle whisper of their work. Yet, in these quiet moments, a new language was spoken. A shared glance across the fire that lasted a moment too long. The brush of his fingers against hers as he handed her a cup of hot tea. A simple touch that sent a jolt of warmth through her entire body. One afternoon, as she was gathering herbs by the creek, her foot slipped on a mossy rock. She cried out as she fell, twisting her ankle. Before the sound had faded, Coda was there. He had moved with the silent speed of a shadow, his ever-watchful presence a constant, reassuring force. He knelt and examined her ankle with a gentleness that seemed at odds with his rugged strength. "It is not broken," he said, his voice low, "but you must rest it." He lifted her into his arms as effortlessly as he had in the snowstorm, but this time it was different. This time, she was not unconscious. She wrapped her arms around his neck, her cheek resting against the solid warmth of his chest. She could feel the steady beat of his heart beneath her ear, a rhythm as strong and dependable as the turning of the seasons. In that moment, suspended in his arms, the boundary between protector and protected dissolved into something far more profound, something tender and terrifyingly new. It was the unspoken admission of a burgeoning love, a fragile bloom in the harsh wilderness, threatening to change the landscape of both their lonely lives forever. The peace they had carefully constructed was as fragile as a spider's web, and just as easily torn. It happened on a clear, warm afternoon. Alara was outside, tending to her small patch of herbs, while Koda was in the nearby woods, checking his snares. A flicker of movement in the valley below caught her eye. It was not a deer or an elk. It was a man on a horse, moving with a purpose that was entirely human. He was far away, a mere speck, but an unnatural one in this vast, empty landscape. A cold knot of dread tightened in her stomach. She stood, her hand shading her eyes, her heart beginning a frantic, familiar rhythm of fear. Koda emerged from the trees, moving with his usual silent grace. He had seen it too. He came to stand beside her, his body a solid, unmovable presence. He did not need to ask. He knew. "One man," he said, his voice a low, hard rumble. "A scout. He looks for a sign." They watched as the rider slowly made his way up the valley, his path meandering but drawing inexorably closer to their hidden clearing. The world seemed to hold its breath. The birdsong faded. The gentle breeze felt like a cold premonition. Alistair had found her trail. The reprieve was over. "Go inside," Koda commanded, his tone leaving no room for argument. "Stay away from the window." Alara hesitated, her gaze locked on the approaching rider. "Koda, go," he repeated, his eyes never leaving the man in the valley. She retreated into the cabin, her newfound courage feeling like a distant memory. She was a city girl again, terrified and helpless. She pressed herself against the log wall, her ears straining for any sound. She heard Koda move away from the cabin, melting back into the forest. The minutes stretched into an eternity. She could hear the faint sound of the horses' hooves now, a slow, methodical clopping that sounded like a funeral drum. Then silence, a new, more terrifying silence. She held the small wooden sparrow Koda had carved for her, its smooth surface a small anchor in a sea of terror. Suddenly, a man's voice, rough and unfamiliar, cut through the quiet. "Hello? Anyone in this valley?" Then Koda's voice, calm and cold as a river stone. "This is Lakota land. You are not welcome here." The other man laughed, a harsh, ugly sound that grated on the peace of the valley. "This ain't no Lakota land no more, friend. This is Mr. Alistair Finch's future property. I'm looking for something that belongs to him. A woman." A long pause. Alara held her breath. "There are no women here," Koda stated, his voice flat and final. "Only ghosts. You would be wise to leave before you become one." She heard the other man curse, followed by the sound of a horse turning quickly. The hoofbeats grew fainter and fainter until they disappeared completely. Koda returned to the cabin moments later. His face was like a stone mask, but she could see the tension in the set of his jaw. The peace was gone, replaced by the grim certainty of a coming storm. "He will go back and tell Finch what he found," she whispered, her voice barely audible. "He will tell him there is a man here." Koda looked at her, and for the first time, she saw not just a protector, but a warrior. "Let him," Koda said, his dark eyes blazing with a cold fire. "This is my home. This is your home now. We will not run." The inevitable arrived 3 days later, not with the subtlety of a lone scout, but with the arrogant thunder of shod hooves and the glint of rifle barrels in the morning sun. Alistair Finch did not come to parley. He came to conquer. He rode at the head of 5 hired men, their faces hard and cruel, mercenaries who sold their loyalty to the highest bidder. They reined in their horses at the edge of the clearing, forming a semicircle that was both a cage and a firing line. Alistair, dressed in expensive riding clothes that were an affront to the rugged landscape, swung down from his horse. His handsome face was twisted into a sneer of possessive triumph. "Alara," he called out, his voice smooth and cultured but laced with venom. "Your little wilderness adventure is over. Come out now. I will be lenient with this savage who has clearly addled your mind. Inside the cabin, Alara felt the old fear rise up, a cold bile in her throat. But as she looked at Kota, who stood calmly checking the load in his rifle, a different feeling took root beside it. It was anger, a righteous, burning anger at this man who saw her as an object, who saw Kota as a subhuman obstacle. I will not let him take you, Kota said, his voice a low promise. He moved to the single window, his profile stark against the light. Nor will I let him take you, Alara said, her own voice surprising her with its firmness. She was no longer the terrified woman who had collapsed in the snow. She was a woman who had learned to tend a garden, to read the land, to survive. She would not hide while the man who had saved her fought her battle alone. Stay back, Kota ordered, but she shook her head. You taught me to survive, Kota. You did not teach me to cower. A grim smile touched Kota's lips. He nodded once, a gesture of respect and acceptance. Then stay low. The confrontation began with words. Send out my property, savage, Alistair bellowed. Her name is Alara, Kota called back, his voice carrying with an authority that Alistair's wealth could not buy. She is not property. She is a free woman, and this is her home. Leave now. Alistair laughed, a cold, humorless sound. I think not. He raised his hand, a signal to his men. The first shot was not from their rifles. It was from Kota's. He fired not at a man, but at a hornet's nest tucked under the eaves of the cabin, a nest Alara had pointed out to him just yesterday. The nest exploded, and a furious, buzzing cloud descended on the hired men and their horses. The animals panicked, rearing and screaming, throwing their riders. Chaos erupted. In that moment of confusion, Kota took aim and fired again, his shot hitting the rifle of the nearest man, sending it spinning from his grasp. It was the signal. As the men scrambled, distracted and swatting at the angry hornets, Alara acted. Remembering Kota's lessons on diversion, she threw the cabin's entire supply of dried peppers and hot chili into the roaring hearth. A thick, acrid smoke billowed up the chimney and poured out into the clearing, a choking, blinding cloud that added to the pandemonium. Men coughed, their eyes streaming. Alistair, enraged, fired wildly toward the cabin. But Kota was no longer at the window. He was a phantom, melting out the back door and circling through the trees he knew so well. The fight was no longer a siege. It was Kota's hunt, on his land. Alara, crouched by the hearth, clutched the small wooden sparrow. She had not fired a gun, but she had fought. She had stood with him, and the battle was not over yet. The clearing became a stage for a brutal, desperate ballet. Alistair's men, disoriented by smoke and stinging insects, were no match for a man who was part of the forest itself. Kota moved like a vengeful spirit, using the trees and rocks for cover, his shots precise and disabling. He was not a killer by nature, but he was a protector by choice. One by one, the hired guns were taken down. A shot to the leg, a shattered shoulder, a rifle knocked from a hand. They were warriors for pay, not for purpose, and their will to fight dissolved quickly against an unseen, unstoppable foe. Soon, only Alistair remained. He stood in the center of the clearing, his fine clothes smudged with dirt, his face a mask of disbelief and fury. His men were groaning on the ground around him. His victory, which he had assumed was his right, had turned to ash. He saw Alara then, standing in the doorway of the cabin, her face determined, her posture defiant. The sight of her, not cowering but standing proud, seemed to break something in him. His possessive rage boiled over. You! He screamed, his voice cracking. You chose this animal over me? If I can't have you, no one will. He raised his pistol, ignoring the wounded men, ignoring Kota who was now emerging from the trees. His sole focus was Alara, the possession that had defied him. Time seemed to slow. Alara saw the black hole of the pistol's barrel, the madness in Alistair's eyes. She did not scream or run. She stood her ground. A shot rang out, but it was not from Alistair's gun. It was from Kota's rifle. Alistair jerked, a look of surprise on his face, before crumpling to the ground, his pistol falling from his limp hand. Silence descended upon the clearing, thick and heavy. The smell of gunpowder and acrid smoke hung in the air. The threat was over. The tyrant was vanquished. Coda walked slowly to where Alistair lay, ensuring he was no longer a danger, before turning his gaze to Alara. He walked towards her, his face grim, his body tense from the fight. He stopped in front of her, his dark eyes searching hers, looking for any sign of the fear and fragility he had first found. He saw none. He saw only strength. He reached out, his hand gently touching her cheek. "It is over," he said, his voice rough with emotion. She leaned into his touch, covering his hand with her own. "We are safe," she whispered, correcting him. The word "we" hung in the air between them, a promise kept, a future begun. And as the sun climbed higher, casting its light on the quiet aftermath, they stood together, two solitary souls who had found in each other not just a sanctuary from the world, but a home. The quiet epilogue to their violent struggle had begun. A year later, the cabin was no longer a sparse shelter but a true homestead. A sturdy fence enclosed a thriving garden where Alara knelt, her hands in the rich earth. A second room had been added to the cabin, built with logs Coda had felled and she had helped him place. Laughter, a sound once foreign to this valley, was now a common occurrence. Coda came and sat beside her, handing her a newly carved figure. A magnificent eagle, its wings spread wide. Their hands touched, a familiar, comforting gesture that spoke volumes. Alara's other hand rested on her gently rounded stomach, a silent, powerful testament to the new life they had created together. A life born not from fleeing a past, but from building a future. And so, a story that began in the fury of a blizzard finds its peace in the warmth of a summer sun. Alara, the runaway bride, did not simply find a protector in the stoic Lakota hunter. She found a partner, a teacher, and in the heart of the unforgiving wilderness, she discovered the one thing she never knew she was searching for herself. Her journey was not merely from a life of gilded oppression to one of rustic freedom. It was an internal odyssey from fear to courage, from being an object of possession to an agent of her own destiny. Coda, the man who had built a fortress of solitude around his grief, found that the walls he had erected to keep the world out could not withstand the quiet persistence of a heart in need of healing. In protecting Alara, he rescued himself. He allowed his own ghosts to find peace and discovered that a home is not built from logs and stone, but from shared purpose, mutual respect, and the courageous act of loving again. Their love story is a quiet epic, a testament to the idea that true strength is not the absence of wounds, but the courage to let them heal. It reminds us that sometimes the greatest families are not the ones we are born into, but the ones we find, the ones we build in the shelter of each other's care. Their shared life in that peaceful valley serves as a powerful symbol. It tells us that redemption is possible, that new beginnings can sprout from the ashes of a tragic past, and that hope is not a fragile thing, but a resilient force of nature, capable of thriving in the harshest of landscapes. Their tale has now been told, but its echo remains. We are left to ponder the nature of home, of love, and of the incredible resilience of the human spirit. What do you believe is the true foundation of a home? Is it the walls that surround us, or the love that fills the space within? We would be honored to read your thoughts and feelings in the comments below. Your perspective enriches this community of story lovers. And if this tale of frontier romance and inspirational survival has touched your heart, please show your support by liking this video and subscribing to our channel for more stories that explore the depths of the human experience. Thank you for joining us on this journey.